and say good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this briefing of the Maryland Transit Caucus. Today, we are joined by three researchers from, oh no, I can't minimize my screen to see my notes. Uh-oh. There we go. Three researchers from the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education, which is part of the University of Maryland College Park. And the center works to create a more sustainable, vibrant, and enhanced quality of life for communities across the globe. And today we're going to be hearing about several of their Maryland research projects, including the results of the Maryland Commuter Survey, an evaluation of Maryland's commuter tax credit, and the Purple Line Corridor community outreach that they've been doing. So specifically, our guests today are Dr. Catherine Howe, who's director of the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education, Dr. Chester Harvey, who's director of the Transportation Policy Research Group within the center, and Sheila Somashaker, who's director of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition. So I will turn it over to the three of you for your presentations. Thanks for being here today.
Great. Well, I get the joy of kicking us off a little bit just to give you a little background on the National Center for Smart Growth, or NCSG. Next slide, please. So we really use kind of the power and work that we have as a university-based research center, including sort of our ability to convene and other things to do research, collaborative practice, education and curricular development, and advocacy. We really see that the future is really in compact, walkable, sustainable communities, but it really doesn't exist outside the policies and planning practices, as well as the research and education that's been a pivotal part of our history. And so we really tend to start really with those who are most vulnerable to displacement due to redevelopment, environmental hazards, and disinvestment. And so really working towards these areas. Next slide. We have, in addition to having research in the center that goes across our programs, we have four primary programs that you may or may not be familiar with. Two you'll hear about today. One is PALS, the Partnership for Action, Learning, and Sustainability, which is essentially a way of connecting classrooms to sort of agencies and community organizations that need work done. So we've done anything from which you may hear Secretary Day talk about the comprehensive plan for Salisbury when he was mayor, to water testing in the Anacostia River with microbiology students. You can see here the top picture is a group of geology students doing ground penetrating radar at a Black church in Montgomery County, looking to see where people are buried in their cemetery. And the bottom picture is a playground that was worked on and designed by a group of students in Baltimore City. So we really will work across the state, working with anybody from state agencies. The Department of Natural Resources is one of the big partners for this, to counties and small towns, as well as nonprofit organizations. Next, please. Our next group is the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, and this is a national organization of the group that works towards maintaining small businesses, particularly in immigrant corridors and corridors where you've got a lot of Black-owned businesses. They really include policymakers, nonprofit advocates, technical assistance providers, real estate developers. I mean, sort of anybody who touches the world of small business, they're working to preserve that. And so they're doing a lot of research and case studies, as well as having an annual policy summit that pulls folks together. Next, please. And this one you'll hear about in just a minute, so I won't tell you too much, but the Transportation Policy Research Group, led by Dr. Chester Harvey, does exactly that, really looks at different types of transportation. The biggest work that they do is with the Maryland Department of Transportation on the Commuter Survey, but this also includes some of the work that crosses over different programs, including working around with young people around bicycling and multimodal transportation. And so I will leave that to let Chester talk more about this. And finally, next is the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, which is a coalition of grassroots community-based organizations, large nonprofits, agency staff, and state government that are working on anti-displacement work and equitable development along the Purple Line. So this is housing work, as well as small business and cultural displacement as well. So this is just kind of a snapshot of what we do, but we really do look for partnerships across communities and across state government. to really try to improve research, but also community engagement around our communities. So will now just turn it over to Chester Harvey to kick us off on his work.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Howell. As she said, my name is Chester Harvey. I'm the director of what's called the Transportation Policy Research Group. And this is a group that's formed by an interagency agreement with the Maryland Department of Transportation. We also end up working really closely with the Department of Planning. And it's in its 16th year. It's been going on for quite some time. And this has been a really useful continuity where we essentially offer an analytic resource for MDOT on policymaking on a whole variety of issues. Back when this first started, we were doing a bunch of model development work, which has actually now been transferred over into the practice of the agency. And we've turned more recently to developing novel data and investigating some policy issues that I'll speak about in a few minutes around the commuter tax credit. And then we're about to start a new project, which is pretty exciting, that investigates ways we can develop performance metrics for the state transportation system that are more informed by opportunities that the system provides to people, as opposed to just how many lanes we're laying down, for example, which is becoming a somewhat outdated way of examining performance. So I'm going to talk about three different projects, as Delegate Carr mentioned, and I'll try to keep it relatively condensed so we can hear from Sheila about the purple line and still have lots of time for questions and conversation. Next slide, Sheila. So the first of these projects is an ongoing project that we have over the past 5 years, actually. My predecessor in this role ran an initial survey right at the beginning, well, sort of during the midst of the pandemic, I guess, and then that transitioned into what we're now calling the Maryland Commuter Survey, and that's been running for the last 4 years. We're about actually to start the fifth one, or sorry, the fourth survey of this type in 2025. And what this is aimed at doing is sort of getting a handle on how the state has adjusted to the pandemic, but more importantly, what is sort of the transportation landscape post-pandemic. And so what this does is it gathers a sample of about 1,000 people who work within the state of Maryland, and that's the sampling strategy for that is designed so that it's as representative as possible statistically of Maryland workers. We use a weighting approach to try to line that up as closely as possible with the demographics and with the geography of the state. Sheila, next slide. And then every year we put out a fact sheet for the survey, in addition to a longer form report, which is designed for the Maryland Department of Transportation. But that fact sheet is something that we publish on NCSU's website and we distribute to different agencies, and we would love to share that with you as they come out as well, as a link for policymakers about sort of the state of transportation and particularly for commuters within the state. So I'm going to go through a few of these results, just things that I think might sort of stand out to you. Sheila, next slide, please. So a striking result, and perhaps isn't terribly surprising to folks, is that the state has done sort of a bunch of backflips around in-person and remote work over the course of the pandemic. So, back in 2019, before the pandemic, of course, many people were working in person, and many fewer were working remotely. That changed overnight in 2020. And now we've really seen that climb, the in-person work share climb back to approximately where it was before. There's definitely some measurement error in here because we weren't measuring it quite the same way back in 2019. So, we look at this as evidence that the state in many ways has returned to the types of commuting patterns that it had pre-pandemic. Sheila, next slide. So That said, one of the things that's really sort of obvious on the ground is that folks aren't necessarily back commuting to all the same places. There's still a lot of remote work happening, and that's impacting cities, particularly sort of business centers, Baltimore being a key example, around the state. The share of folks that are back to commuting fully in person, who work in non-office settings, so this would be any sort of manual labor or a place where you really have to be, in person, that share is, 90 some odd percent, as opposed to folks who are working in office settings, which tend to predominate, of course, in downtown areas, and in office parks and suburban places. That share is really still quite high, for hybrid and fully remote workers. And so this is a challenge that the state is facing, both in terms of how transportation systems support commuting, but also in terms of the recovery of places with an office economy, and how that's sort of transitioning out of the pandemic. Next slide, please, Sheila. Another thing that we investigate is opportunities for folks to commute by alternative modes. And so I'm glad to speak to the Transit Caucus about this. Of course, the sort of preponderance of, oh, this is interesting. Did we skip ahead 2 slides, Sheila? Okay, well, we skipped a slide, but there's a slide in there. My version is somehow different than Sheila's, that looks at mode share. And of course, within Maryland, the vast majority of folks are commuting by automobile. It's somewhere around 70%. Many more people who are low income commute by alternative modes, but still the predominant mode for low-income workers is by automobile. And so there's an interest in, figuring out how we can better position transit and alternative modes so that they're competitive, they're sort of reasonable options for folks to commute by. And so one of the analyses that we've done, looking at sort of the time that it takes people to commute by different modes. So that's what's on this slide. On the left-hand side, it shows the times that are reported by people that we surveyed, and so these are like real commuting times. On average, commutes within the state are about half an hour by driving, compared to by transit modes, approaching an hour, 47 minutes by bus, 57 minutes by rail, so markedly longer. And that's something that state transit policy can try to address by improving levels of service on transit, by giving people more options to use transit in a way that is really time competitive. Of course, many fewer people are walking and biking, and those options, when people are exercising to commute, frankly, tend to be more competitive, similar to options by driving. On the right side of the screen is a hypothetical example. So whereas on the left side, these are folks who are already taking, either driving alone or riding buses or walking or biking. The right side is saying, well, what happens if people, if all of the commuters that we surveyed were to drive or take transit or even ride a bicycle? And what this illustrates is that it's just a lot harder for people to commute within the state of Maryland by transit. If you, on average, as a Maryland commuter, tried to take transit to get to work, you'd be traveling about an hour and a half. And that includes, many people who live quite far from transit, whose jobs are quite far from transit. And so this is useful as a way of illustrating the need to build out those systems and kind of reduce that gap between the hypothetical drive time of only 23 minutes for commuters and transit time of 90 minutes. And unsurprisingly, hypothetical commutes by bike quite large, but interesting that they're about the same as transit. So, not too many people are going to want to ride a bike 90 minutes to work, but those who do sometimes make it happen. Sheila, next slide, please. So let's turn to a different project we worked on this past year. This is about how to encourage the use of the Maryland Commuter Tax Credit. I wonder if any of the delegates in the room may have been involved with passing this legislation. It's gone through a few different iterations. And if that's the case, then I apologize in advance for maybe not being as expert on the legislation as you are. But we did study some of the impacts and how it works within, among users and also among folks within the state, both at MDOT and within counties whose job it is to try to promote the use. Sheila, next slide. So on the left, this is a diagram that MDOT has prepared about sort of how you can go about claiming this tax credit. And the key takeaway here is that it's hard. There's actually a lot of pieces to it. There's a lot of different types of credit that you can claim for transit, van pooling, cash in lieu of parking. There's a telework credit now, which was a recent introduction. And what this credit allows for is claiming off of business taxes 50% of qualified expenses that business pays for on behalf of their employees, up to $100 per employee per month. In 2022, the 2022 law that was passed, that was an update to this policy, allocates $1 million annually to the program. But in the 2023 tax year, only about $160,000 of that was claimed. And so this is a really underutilized program. And part of what we were trying to get at is why, and then how we could better incentivize the use within the state. Next slide. So some key findings around this. There's really a disconnect in a lot of cases between commuters who want to commute by alternative modes and employers, some of whom understand that this is a really useful benefit to offer their employees, and others of whom say, well, what's the ROI for us on this? And that's a difficult thing for advocates that are trying to promote the program around the state to try to essentially convince employers of. One of the things that we found is that if commuters who were interested in using alternative modes and were interested in receiving a tax credit could claim that themselves as opposed to having to go through the intermediary of the employer, that might be a really useful way for essentially a broader array of commuters to actually make use of it. And there have been a number of case examples in other states and cities that have had more direct tax credits to users as opposed to the model that goes through employers. It's difficult for promoters of the program. So this, again, both within MDOT and also there are these county coordinator positions that do a lot of groundwork around this to reach appropriate decision makers. And part of this is the complexity of a tax credit structure that kind of requires these champions within employers. So you might have an executive at an employer that says this is really important, and then they need to kind of push that through HR, finance, et cetera. It's a little bit sort of unclear sort of who all needs to be at the table, and getting all of them at the table is difficult. And so that might be sort of an intrinsic difficulty with this being an employer-based system as opposed to a single decision maker for the commuters themselves. And then despite all of MDOT's work, and they have done a lot of work on this, as you see from the diagram on the previous slide, trying to streamline how people understand how to file, what they can claim, all of this. It's really perceived by employers who we interviewed for this research as both complex, so figuring out what they could claim, what the different options were. There was also an issue, frankly, with feeling of undependability. Employers would file for the credit, and sometimes it would take years to get through the system, and they really weren't sure that they were going to get that money back because it is a reimbursement process. And so these are essentially administrative aspects that could be ironed out to just make it more attractive. And then the last point I want to make is that sort of despite all of these sort of critiques and difficulties, the administrative support for this program from MDOT, which is actually part of the more recent legislation for the tax credit, has been really crucial. And so that is a really good direction that the program has gone, where it's being overseen by an administrator named Stacey King, who's at MDOT, who has been an important touch point for employers, having that person that they can easily contact. And so that was a really good direction that it's going. Stacey, of course, would like to be able to offer more tax guidance than she can. And so if there's a way of doing that, having even sort of tax professionals be able to offer advice, that would be a useful improvement. I'm seeing a hand up from Ann Healy. I'm wondering, should we take questions
How
now
about
or
we
should we wait?
finish your part of the presentation and then we can pause for a couple of questions if that works. And Delegate Healy will take you up first when we get to that point.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Sheila, next slide, please. And I think we'll get through this fairly quickly. And then a third project, which, as I mentioned, we're just getting started with right now, but I think is exciting, and it's sort of again informing statewide policy in a way that's really useful. Has to do with these accessibility measures for what MDOT refers to as attainment reporting. This is essentially the statewide performance metric system that informs what infrastructure is prioritized, whether the state is achieving its goals. Sheila, next slide. So every year, MDOT puts out this attainment report. Maybe this cover is familiar to you. I believe it gets distributed within the legislature. This includes a whole bunch of different performance indicators for how the statewide transportation system is doing. Among them are things like population within a half mile of a transit station, percentage of lane miles that are susceptible to flooding, percentage of state-owned directional miles that have sidewalks. You can see how this gets pretty technical pretty fast and into the weeds of what infrastructure is on the ground and whether we're building it out. And what is sort of legacy about many of these measures of how well the state is doing is that they reflect whether we're building infrastructure, not necessarily how useful it is to the population. And so there's a transition that has happened first within academic research about how to evaluate performance, and is sort of making its way very slowly into on-the-ground policy. And Maryland is actually leading the way with this to try to transition some of these measures from just are there lane miles to what do lane miles connect people with? So next slide, please, Sheila. So for example, we are looking to transition a measure like population within a half mile of a transit stop to jobs reachable within 60 minutes on transit. This makes sort of a measurement connection to some of the things that we're getting at with the commuter survey. Another type of transition you could think of would be miles of low stress bikeways. This is getting a little bit jargony, but that's a way that we measure what basically feels like a comfortable place to ride a bike, to can you reach schools via low stress streets, which is sort of putting that infrastructure into practice for people on the ground. There are a lot of technical hurdles with both how to measure, how to even know where the jobs are and how to sort of measure how long it takes to get there. And that's what this project is tackling, is building some pilot tools for the state to accomplish that. Sheila, next slide. And so, as an example, this work has been done at a much more sort of big picture level by some partners that the state is working with and that we have a relationship with at the University of Minnesota. So here you can see different, access to jobs broken down by census tracts, But what we are aiming to do is to break that down much more granularly and say, well, if we add this new roadway segment or this new transit system, or if we increase the headways on MARC, how does that change the outcomes? And so then it will be able to be used for even prioritizing which infrastructures get built, because they might have the biggest impact. Sheila, I think that's the end of my slides. Should we take a question from Delegate Healy, or should we?
Yep, that'd be great.
Okay.
Delegate Healy, go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. This is very helpful and very useful, and I thank you for all your hard work on the subject. I have a question, kind of an overarching question, but first of all, the whole issue of tax credits that are not being used. I spent a long time on the Ways and Means Committee. I was vice chair for 10 years, a long time ago. But I know we're entering a time of fiscal crisis and the budget, and we're going to be looking at tax credits that are not being used as something that we can get rid of totally, because if they're not being used, that money can be used elsewhere in the budget. And so I'm asking you, with that in mind, if all these things that you've presented to us, you have a priority list. What is the most cost effective? What is the most quickly effective ways to help get this whole process moving?
My pie in the sky recommendation on the tax credits would be to try to reorient them to be direct to users.
Okay, so a grant program would probably be more effective.
Right, or other states. So we found examples of other states offering tax credits directly, for transit passes that people are buying, or for e-bikes.
Again, though, I'm talking about cost effective in the current fiscal situation. I'm not asking for a pie in the sky. I'm asking for reality right now.
Right. I mean, I guess. Right. I mean, the reason I use the word pie in the sky is that it would take a different law, and so I recognize that that's more challenging. Um, I think that
We're looking for the biggest bang for the buck. We have a certain limited amount of money to spend on anything. This is a priority for us, but we have to know that we're in competition for other priorities. So given that,
yeah.
like a first, second, third, what are the best ways we can spend whatever money we have available for this?
So I think that I should probably get back to you on that with a little bit more thought. But I mean, I would say that allocating money to transit systems is incredibly important. I'm aware that $1 million that is allocated to this is not going to go super far in transit systems. So there's also that reality. But I do think that maintaining this tax credit program and just making it as easy as possible for people to apply to it is really useful. A lot of employers have found that very useful.
Okay, thank you
Yeah.
so much. One last question, if I may, Madam Chair, and that is about one of the things that makes it possible for people who live within a half mile and all of that. We have to build housing that's accessible to Metro. We don't have enough housing in the state, and where we want to increase density near transit. Is that anywhere in your studies?
So the way that shows up is that MDOT is using our studies to help decide where they prioritize building or developing transit-oriented development. And so that's not directly studied by our studies,
Okay.
that development potential, but MDOT is putting a lot of renewed effort into TOD, and then MDP is also picking up on that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you,
Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Thank you.
And
And
I'll
and I
note
would
that,
just, Delegate Healy, I
please
would
go
also
ahead.
just
Yeah.
flag Sorry, I would just flag also really quickly, we are working on a state housing needs assessment for the Department of Housing and Community Development. And this question of looking at capacity to build and where do we build is part of that conversation. It's one of the tasks that they have actually given us. So in other parts of NCSG, we're working on this question.
Great. Let's recognize Senator Ellis next.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presenters. And for a quick note, in 2019, I had a tour of your facilities at the University of Maryland College Park. I was really impressed by the work you did then, and I'm more impressed now. And it's so much needed in Maryland, especially in my district. I represent Charles County, where we have the documented worst commute in the nation. That's been my number one priority. And so I'm very thankful for the Transit Caucus and the work that has been done to really emphasize transit needs. And I'm very concerned about that chart of unused tax credits. I know a lot of people who could use that $100 a month, and I wonder if the difficulties in getting that credit is basically the tax preparers and tax filers cannot have access to appropriate help. And I say that being the Senate chair for the Joint Committee on Management of Public Funds. We had a hearing this past, well, a couple months ago, where the controller talked about how they don't have the resources to answer a lot of calls that comes into the controller's office. I'm sure my colleagues have heard that complaint from their constituents, where over 1 million calls go unanswered because they don't have the people to answer these calls and to help constituents. And I think I'm not sure if you shared, Mr. Harvey, the reason why people are not using this money that's available to them. Could you share any reasons why you think this money is not being used or being pulled out of the state treasury and into the pockets of our constituents?
Yeah, I mean, I think the really short answer is that constituents want to use it and that employers are not seeing a return on investment to create, because employers are the ones that actually have to claim the credit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that's a disconnect. And I think if there's a way that that the law could be reframed so that it actually provides subsidies directly to consumers, that actually could be really useful.
So the employers have to claim the credit and put that in the paycheck for their employees?
Yes, and in fact, they have to match it. They have to match it 1-to-1 with the state. So in order for me to get a transit pass for my employer has to put $100 on that card, and the state puts $100 on that card. If the employer doesn't take that initiative, then I don't get a transit card.
Okay. Is this for transit or is like for people to buy gas if to commute 50 miles one way?
It's at the moment it's sustainable. It's sort of demand reduction and sustainable commuting modes. So it's transit, telecommuting, cash in lieu of parking, van pooling, etc. Yeah,
Okay.
there
Oh,
are states that have done it just for all commuting, and that has a slightly different policy motive, but there's a precedent for that.
do you think that might be a good thing in Maryland, make it for all commuting where all commuters can get in? So focus on transit, but transit is not available to so many of our commuters.
Right. I think it would all get used. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good
Yeah.
answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ellis. And then 2 quick questions out of the chat before we move on to Sheila's presentation. So one, we are recording this briefing, so that recording will be made available to all of the members of the Transit Caucus afterwards. And then one more question for you, Chester. Is there any gender analysis on the presented survey data? I think this was for the commuter survey.
Yeah, we do record gender and we do some analysis with it. By and large, the differences aren't great. But as expected and is seen in lots of studies around this, men are more likely to ride transit and take active modes than women. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And we'll turn it over to Sheila now for her presentation on the Purple Line. Good.
Sorry, bear with me one moment. All right. Um, Hi everyone. I'm Sheila Somashaker. I'm director of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition. Thank you so much for having us here, and I'm really happy to see a few of the leaders who represent Purple Line communities on the call as well. The Purple Line Corridor Coalition, as Dr. Howell mentioned at the opening, is a collaborative that's housed at the National Center for Smart Growth, but we are very much a collaborative that includes nonprofits that are both regional and local, public agencies, elected officials, local churches and community-based groups, developers, lenders are all part of this collective effort to really drive positive outcomes for the communities along the Purple Line route in the Maryland suburbs of DC. And although I am one of a handful of people who wake up and go to sleep thinking about the Purple Line, we do see our work in the context of the statewide, transit networks. We know that the issues, both the opportunities and the challenges that we see along the Purple Line are not dissimilar to the issues that we see in other transit corridors across the state, and especially in places where transit is expected to have transformative impact on local economies and on communities along the line. Just really quickly, how we work, we build collective will. This is the essence of what I do in my day-to-day work, building trust and strategic agendas across the spectrum of power, working with folks in decision-making positions, as well as folks at the community level around issues like affordable housing, small business preservation and growth, workforce development, as well as vibrant and sustainable communities, which includes a transportation element to it, as well as placemaking. And there are a few kind of areas where we are leaning in our capacities that we are leaning into as a center in terms of supporting the work that's happening along the line. One is data, as you heard from Drs. Howell and Harvey. We have a lot of really excellent research and data capacity within the center that is that we work to bring to bear for the community goals that are established along the line. Resources and funding has been a huge focus of our work, attracting affordable housing capital, attracting grants to help drive capacity at the local level around equitable development. And we've been pretty successful as a collective in attracting funding to the corridor. Community capacity is a huge area of focus for us as well. We want to make sure that community-based groups and the folks who are going to be here long term are equipped with both the funding and the capacity to kind of continue the work, and that the work that we do is strengthening what's here now and the existing capacity that's here now. And what I really want to talk about, although we have a lot of work that we do around, again, affordable housing and small business, for example, is some recent work that we've been doing the last couple of years around multi-mobility and making sure that the Purple Line is accessible in order to unlock kind of the benefits of the Purple Line and make sure that the investments in TOD around the line are optimized. We want to make sure that the Purple Line actually works and that people can get to Purple Line stations and around Purple Line stations without getting in a car. So that is what I'm going to talk to you about today very briefly. So this work started a few years ago with an FTA TOD planning grant where we did a deep dive on access needs to Purple Line stations, looking at what the gaps are from a technical perspective and looking at how easy or hard it is to get to the Purple Line stations, as well as to points of interest such as jobs and grocery stores and healthcare facilities. And what we discovered, just in a nutshell, is that there are a whole lot of gaps when we're talking about the needs to really get to a place where we have walkable and bikeable communities along the Purple Line. So this is sort of where we landed on our analysis, and from there, we said, what can we do about it? How do we actually mobilize to get some changes to happen? And so we have a second FTA TOD planning grant that is underway right now that is really more about drawing kind of community attention and mobilizing around some of the to hopefully help fill some of these gaps and to bring community and agency folks together around that. So we are doing 3 community-led walks at 3 key station areas along the corridor. We did our first walk in the Long Branch area earlier this year, our second walk in Riverdale just a little over a month ago, and we're going to be doing our third walk in the Tacoma Langley area in the spring. Though it started with technical work. So we had sort of this higher level assessment of the gaps. What we were not aware of, what we had not done as yet was look at what the current conditions are and the full picture of what the proposed improvements are when you put together plans from SHA, from the MTA Purple Line project, from the county plans, and in some cases municipal plans. And we put together the best picture that we could of what those planned improvements are. And it's actually, even for people who kind of live in this space, it's actually a very difficult picture to understand when you put all of that together. And the second piece was then taking that to the community. If it's hard for technocrats and planners who are living in this space to really understand what the planned improvements are, there was some work to be done to get folks in the community who are living near the line up to speed on what those planned improvements were. So the photos I have here are from our Long Branch walk in May. We started with a community workshop. And a bunch of community outreach that preceded it, working with a group called Cheer that's really active in the Long Branch community and very connected with the renters and the folks who are most impacted by some of the pressures that the Purple Line is going to bring. And we did a workshop where we brought folks together and they presented what we think we know about the planned improvements around the Purple Line and had folks come together and ask questions. And we were, surprised that the questions, some of them, even in 2024, were very basic questions that spoke to information that was not getting to the community. There were questions about whether the Purple Line was going to go underground. And then, as we kind of got into the conversation, it became more questions around, seeing that there was a stop plan in the middle of University Boulevard, and there are questions around, how am I gonna cross the street safely to get to the Purple Line station in the middle of this highway? So from there, we organized those community questions into an actual walk route, had folks from the community lead us through a walk of their neighborhood and ask questions of a number of elected officials and engineers and agency representatives who were then able to kind of answer some of the questions on site. And that's, hopefully the foundation for continued engagement around advocacy in the future. And we did a similar kind of flow in the Riverdale community. So some of the things that have emerged from in terms of the gaps from this, from both the input from the community, the technical work, as well as our experiential walkthrough of these neighborhoods, are things like multi-lane highways with narrow sidewalks next to fast-moving traffic. You've got wide radius corners where vehicles often ignore pedestrians. These streets were not designed for people in many ways. And so these are some great illustrative images of that. Large intersections with slip lanes and no safeguards for pedestrians. So we're in the middle of this project right now. Some of the outputs from the walks are we've had some really good participation from our technical and legislative folks. We've had 39 folks who were kind of the audience for the walks. 18 community presenters. Again, we really worked hard to work with community partners like Cheer, like Central Kenilworth Avenue Revitalization, CDC in Riverdale, and to get folks from different different segments of the community and folks who don't typically have a platform on these issues. And then we have pulled together frequently asked community questions related to the questions that have come up on those walks and the answers from the agency folks to those questions. We're now mobilizing, trying to figure out how do we actually get something done with folks. And our ultimate hope is that we actually are able to help influence the trajectory of the infrastructure investments in the corridor and make improvements that really maximize the transformative opportunity that the Purple Line brings. We're putting billions of dollars into infrastructure, and we really want to make sure that it works for the community, that the decisions that are made are informed by data, and that that it's with the participation of impacted communities. So we're, participating. We know that SHA, for example, is seeking input on the 201 corridor. We're weighing in on that, but there's a lot that we're working to kind of figure out as we go in terms of solutions. And I think as we were preparing for this briefing, we were really thinking about the comprehensive picture of what we're trying to achieve, and the fact that we're not thinking in silos, and that we are, I think, aligned with you all in that way, and that we're thinking about transit as it connects with housing and with small business and with equitable development as a holistic picture, with transportation being a really key part of that. But we hope that that we can continue staying connected with you all as we think about transportation investments being optimal for a variety of community goals. And yeah, I'll stop there and take any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Sheila on her presentation?
Thank you to Delegate Tarkoudian for your comments there.
All right. Well, we can also just open it up more broadly if there's questions on anything else that was addressed today, or just more broadly for the researchers. I actually do have one question, and maybe this is for Chester. So for the commuter survey, you were focused on Maryland residents who work in Maryland, but I'm curious what data might be available about Maryland residents who work out of state.
Thanks. Yeah, so our sampling frame is Maryland residents, but it's Maryland residents and wherever they work. And so we do actually have some information about folks who are commuting, to certainly DC and Virginia, but also folks that work remotely in other parts of the country. Commuting to DC is fairly common, and it tapers off from there. I'm happy to loop back with you about that. Yeah.
Sounds good. Delegate Solomon.
Thanks. Question for you, Sheila. So I know the walks were focused more on sort of like collaborative, sort of holistic need areas, but wondering if there might be a possibility to do more of sort of a specific walkshed analysis. We've got communities that are going to be in and around Purple Line stops that aren't necessarily like business impact communities, but where we'll need, and we've had some of these conversations with State Highway Administration around, and I know the county is starting to look at this, like really improving pedestrian safety, like Littonsville and the stop that's going to be on 16th Street that'll serve Georgia Avenue. So we'd be curious if maybe at some point, I mean, obviously it doesn't need to be tomorrow, but maybe later in the spring when the weather warms up again, if we could do more sort of like a walkshed look at that, if you all would be open to that.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to share with you some of the work that we did under the first FTA grant as well, which has some information. We did that analysis on 11 stations. I'd be happy to share that with you, and then yeah, would absolutely be happy to look at other ways we can engage and bring the right information together to make some changes. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for the presentation.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Julie. Since we have additional time, I want to ask a question going back to Chester. So the chart you have on performance indicators about the miles of lower level of traffic stress score, and then the arrow pointed to schools and talk about reachable via, I think, low level streets. I'm not sure what that is. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, level of traffic stress is a way that we measure how good streets are for walking and biking along. And so the reason that example was given for schools is that there's often a high priority given to the ability to reach schools by walking and biking for students to access.
Yeah. So whose priority is that? Whose priority is that high for?
That is I mean the current performance metric around just how many low stress streets there are in the state is set by MDOT. And the idea of how well does that help reach schools is just an example of a way that that has been framed as useful for reaching destinations.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's not a currently set in policy at the state level.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm curious on that. So, I mean, a little background. For like several years, I put in a safe pathway to school bill, right? Because so many schools don't have sidewalks, and I saw kids walking after a snowstorm in Charles County to Thomas Stone High School on the road, with a snowbank, no sidewalks at all. And I put in this bill, and people in Montgomery County, Mako, people in Charles County came out heavy against the bill and said it's too expensive to build safe pathways to schools. In Montgomery County alone, it's like $90 million to do that. They're like, bill is too expensive, so let's do nothing. So when you mention priority for this, I'm like, whose priority is it? Because folks aren't doing anything. I know Delegate Solomon put in a bill touching on that a few years ago when I was on the Triple E committee, and that went through. But the major problem is still there. So when you say it's a priority, I'm like, whose priority is it? Because in Annapolis and the counties, and they're like, no, we're not priority. We don't care about this. We're not going to do anything about it. And then when kids get hit, everyone's up in arms. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. And then nothing happens. So, and there are federal grants for, safe sidewalks to school. I mean, I'm working with, but I mean, still, institutions, counties, locales decide to do nothing about it. I'm sorry, I sound like I'm on a high horse, but that's an issue, and I wanted to kind of see where we can go to go forward with that since you brought up the topic.
I appreciate that. I think you do a good job of identifying the disconnect between the discourse and what's going on the ground. So yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that there is a contingent within MDOT that is very interested in making that more of a priority. I can't entirely speak. Yeah.
Okay, good. Could you, since you have a contract with them or MOU, whatever you call it, could you connect me with them with this issue? Because I would need to know the people who give a hoot about this, about safe words to school. Okay, if you could reach out to me, I won't take any more.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Senator. Delegate Healy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to actually thank Senator Ellis for bringing that up because I've had a bill in from time to time, and probably again this year, to address the issue of sidewalks and bike paths along state highways. There's a long history to it, but basically, the state highway will build them if they get a memorandum of understanding with the local government that the local government will maintain them. And I'm trying to move off of that because nobody's doing anything now. You're right. Nobody wants to take that responsibility on. And I'm working with a lot of people on that. So we'll see. But that's not what I asked. I raised my hand about a different issue. And that is about what you were talking about earlier. And now I went off on my tangent on that, and I can't remember what the original question was. Just give me a second. We were talking about the impact. It was about the issues around commuters. Oh yeah, I remember what it was now. You talk about people in Maryland residents are working out of state, but there are, and people know that there are a large number of people who have moved out of state and commute to work in Maryland. And I wondered if there was anything in your studies that looks at those patterns as well. We know that there's a transit line from West Virginia that comes all the way into DC. And we know there's the kind of intersections with VRE and MARC in some locations. But I just wondered if you had studied that at all.
Yeah, we've studied those through different mechanisms. Unfortunately, it's cost prohibitive to survey beyond the state boundaries because it just kind of explodes the scope for that survey. But we have done work that looked into demand for connecting MARC and SEPTA together, and that I think is actually moving forward with some sort of connection for people that come from the Philadelphia area. And there's other data that we have about more sort of regional scale movement. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. I don't see any other questions in the chat or hands up. So I think we'll, at this point, wrap up the briefing. Thank you so much to our presenters today for all of the information. This was really informative. We very much enjoyed getting this information. And members, as I mentioned before, we will be sharing this briefing with everyone. And I know there were some different reports and things mentioned in the presentations. I'll try to include those links as well in the email that we send out to members. But thank you everyone for joining today. We are wrapped up for today. Happy holidays, everybody.
Great discussion. Thanks, Julie.